You're about to meet the innovators and influencers who are restoring the Judeo-Christian foundations of our culture right here on The Patrick Coffin Show.
And now, here's your host, Patrick Coffin.
Thanks for joining us. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to the Patrick Coffin Show. I know you're going to get a ton out of today's episode because we're going to go there. That's right. We're going to talk about things that very few people want to talk about directly and frankly, and that is the true nature of Islamic terrorism, a bit of the history of modern irregular warfare, the status of the threat nowadays, and what to do about it going forward. Joining us to go there is Dr. Sebastian Gorka, the Vice President and Professor of Strategy and Irregular Warfare at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. He was formerly the Major General Matthew Horner Distinguished Chair of Military Theory at the Marine Corps University and served as an expert for the Department of Justice during the Boston Marathon bombing trial. His website is thegorkabriefing.com. That's G-O-R-K briefing.com. K-A, I should say, and his latest book is titled Defeating Jihad, the Winnable War. Both are linked at patrickcoffin.media. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Dr. Gorka, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year as well. I thought I'd start with a 10,000 feet above the runway look and kind of go back, just your own story. How did you become interested in Islamic warfare and that brand of military threat? Where did your interest arise?
Originally in college in the UK, I joined the military intelligence reserves of the British Army. So I started doing that kind of national security, counterterrorism, strategic work back in the early 90s. Then after 9/11, I was invited by an amazing U.S. Marine, the late Colonel Nick Pratt, to come and teach a counterterrorism course in Germany for the European Command, bringing together a network of allies to defeat al-Qaeda. And then it just went on from there. Wrote my PhD in religiously informed terrorism, and then moved here with my family 8 years ago and became a Defense Department professor teaching jihadism.
Okay, in a recent article in Military Review called How America Will Be Attacked, Irregular Warfare, the Islamic State, Russia, and China, you wrote the following, quote, "The U.S. is still engaged in the longest formal military campaign since the founding of the Republic," unquote, and you go on to refer to it as a war. Why is no one calling it a war? It's the strangest thing to me that this protracted military engagement is not called officially a war. Do you believe we are at war?
Absolutely. When you've got an enemy that is committed to either your enslavement or your destruction, that is the definition of a war. Why don't call it that? Lots of reasons. I think there's a cultural one. When you say the word war to the average American, they think of, Saving Private Ryan, the Battle of the Bulge, the assault on the beaches at Normandy. We associate war with the large battles between states that were typical of the 20th century. And we don't understand, or we tend to forget, that war is most often fought in an irregular fashion, whether it's against the Barbary pirates off the coast of Tripoli 200 years ago, or whether it's against ISIS in Syria and Iraq today. So we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what war is and what its most common form is. And secondly, there's a political fatigue as well with considering it a war. And then lastly, there's a political reason. The current administration, the outgoing Obama administration, doesn't want to portray this as a war. They see this as violence. They call it violent extremism, which is the result of lack of economic development, unemployment, lack of education. So they've put their own ideological overlay, and they don't want to believe in the existence of evil and the fact that America has enemies around the world.
Definitionally, is ISIS or ISIL, IS, Daesh, is that the latest mask worn by al-Qaeda, or is that something separate and funded differently and on a different ground of attack altogether?
Great question. So the story is originally that ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, came out of al-Qaeda. It was the Iraqi franchise originally about 7 years ago, al-Qaeda in Iraq. It broke ranks with Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current head of al-Qaeda, and then developed into something far, far more dangerous than al-Qaeda ever was. Today, it is a what I call trans-regional insurgency that holds territory in Syria, Libya, Iraq, even Nigeria and Mali. And the biggest difference between al-Qaeda and ISIS is that ISIS, with its declaration of the Islamic State, the Caliphate, at the end of June in 2014, it completely embraced the prophetic eschatology of Islam. As in Christianity, there is a belief in end times amongst Muslims, and as the Christian faith teaches that there will be a final battle on the plains of Megiddo before Judgment Day, Syria, or in Arabic, al-Sham, is denoted as the territory of the last jihad between the infidels and the last true Muslims. And ISIS is saying, we have captured al-Sham, and therefore this jihad is the last jihad. That's why ISIS is so very, very dangerous.
Is it also using the drama of the idea of the last battle to recruit younger members to replace fallen fighters around the world? This idea of the urgency, do or die, there's no tomorrow?
Absolutely. Think about it. Their message is very clear. More than 60,000 social media hits are posted by ISIS every day across the internet. And when they use the phrase, we are the Islamic State of al-Sham, they are sending a very clear message. Your father may have fought the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that's wonderful. That makes him a mujahid. Your uncle may have fought the Indians in Kashmir or the Serbs and Croats in Bosnia, and that makes him a jihadi as well. But if you, young man, or increasingly young woman, if you've ever toyed with the idea of becoming a jihadi, this is it. This is the big one, and this is the last one. And let's not forget, according to the theology of Islam, there is only one guaranteed form of salvation. You can obey everything in the Quran, everything in the Hadith, but the only sure way of salvation is to die the death of the jihadi, die in a war against the infidel. That's how ISIS has recruited more than 85,000 jihadis in just the space of a few years.
The subtitle to your book is The Winnable War, and you've just laid out very clearly the strange nature of this enemy, because it's not funded by one state, it's not even localizable in one geographical area. It's almost like a virus. Is using traditional American-style head-on tactical ops, for lack of a better phrase, you know the language a lot better than I do, that's effective for taking out individuals, but is going after the ideology a little bit like trying to eliminate the color orange by using a trumpet. Does that make sense?
Okay, so this is why I wrote my book, Defeating Jihad. So I have the honor of working with our tier one operators, our guys at JSOC, our Green Berets, you name it. And I tell them, look, America in the last 15 years has become preeminent in kinetic solutions. If we know where you are and if the president gives the green light, we can kill you anywhere in the world in about 72 hours. But that doesn't mean very much if the moment we kill you, 15 people volunteered to replace you. So there was a wonderful Rumsfeld snowflake, these famous short memos Rumsfeld wrote. And in one of them, he I'm not a fan of Donald Rumsfeld, but he asked the question of the 9/11 era. He said, are we killing more of them than we are creating? For me, it's this, whether it's Vietnam or whether it's today, piles of body bags are never a good metric, especially if your enemy wants to die and has a gargantuan recruiting pool. So it's not irrelevant. I mean, killing bad guys is very important. I have nothing against killing bin Laden or Zawahiri or anybody else, but it's less than 20% of this war. We will have won this war when people no longer want to become jihadis, when it is no longer sexy or attractive from the streets of Orlando to Paris to San Bernardino to Brussels to Istanbul, when people are not attracted by that ideology, then we will have won.
How do you delegitimize it without providing something else, a more alternative, a more attractive alternative, like the fullness of truth, let's say?
Yeah. Well, look, we can't delegitimize it directly. You know, I'm a white-skinned Catholic. I can go on Al Jazeera and debate the bad guys, but the fact is, it's going to have to be our allies in the region, the Sunnis, who are actually suffering the most, being killed most often. They're wiping out Yazidis and Christians, but it's the Sunnis that disagree with them that are being targeted primarily. We have to help them. People like General Sisi, King Abdullah of Jordan, send a very clear message. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declares that he is the new defender of the faith, he is the new caliph.
Yeah.
And he's killing more Sunnis than he's killing anybody else. That is a cognitive dissonance that we have to drive a Mack truck through. And we have to understand that Islam is not monolithic. Just travel between Indonesia and Saudi Arabia and you will see how it is heterogeneous. We have to see the atavistic, blood-curdling 7th century one lose popularity to be replaced by a more modern, more Western-oriented version, such as we see in Jordan or Egypt. That's how we do it. Help our Muslim allies delegitimize the Salafist jihadi message.
Which leads me to my next question, and that is the usefulness or not of drawing a bright neon line between radical or extremist jihadi ideology and simply what the Quran teaches and the Hadith teaches. Is that?
Yeah. We don't have a huge, that we could get into a seminarian's debate on the eschatology and the exegesis of the Quran. The fact is, the Quran is rather a smorgasbord. You can find in it nice things about infidels. You can find passages like chapter 9 verse 5 or chapter 9 verse 29 that explicitly say, as the word of Allah, that infidels should be killed or enslaved. So there's no message as there is in the New Testament of a new covenant in which non-violence is the key and sacrifice for the other is the essential message. Also, there's no render unto Caesar passage. As a result, theocracy is rather embedded in the theology of Islam. Yes. Nevertheless, there are solutions, and one of them is exactly what succeeded in Turkey after World War I, when you forcibly separate religion from politics, as Mustafa Kemal Atatürk did, then there is a chance for a Muslim community to function in ways that comport with our modern standards.
I'm very interested in the modern architects, or the godfathers, if you will, of ISIS and its prior iterations. Who is Sayyid Qutb, and why is he important?
Right. So my book, in Defeating Jihad, I walk through. We make a big mistake when we say these are just crazy people and shooting from the hip. Bin Laden, Zawahiri, ISIS, al-Nusra, they follow a game plan. And just as we have our Machiavellis, our Clausewitzes, so do they. And the grand strategists, among them, the three most important I discuss in Defeating Jihad, the first one is Sayyid Qutb. Qutb was the most influential jihadi thinker of the Muslim Brotherhood, who expressed explicitly in his book after World War II called Milestones that Islam isn't just a religion. It is a political project with a global mandate to reestablish the caliphate for the glory of God in a jihad. That is a key message of the modern jihadi movement, and it really starts with Sayyid Qutb in the 1950s.
And some of the leaders are U.S. born. I'm thinking of Anwar al-Awlaki, was an imam and a lecturer and so on. Who was he? Why is he influential? Who did he inspire?
If there's one jihadi who is the most significant jihadi thinker from beyond the grave, it's not bin Laden, it is Anwar al-Awlaki. As you said, I worked on the Boston bombing case. If you look at any significant jihadi attack in the United States, if you dig deep enough, sooner or later, you will find Anwar al-Awlaki lurking there, whether it's YouTube videos watched by the perpetrator or audio recordings of his lectures. This was a Yemeni American who grew up in America, in New Mexico, who is especially dangerous even after he was killed by this administration, because he grew up in America, yet was a Muslim, went back to Yemen, and as such, he straddles the Western and the Middle Eastern culture and can communicate with converts in America or those who grew up here. And as a result, he can package the jihadi message in ways that resonate with young Muslim Americans, and therefore he is very dangerous even after his death.
Like Major Nidal Hasan, the Fort Hood shooter, was also a consumer of his sermons, right?
Not only that, in the case of Major Nidal Hasan, it was even more egregious. He managed to reach out and contact Anwar al-Awlaki and send him emails in which he raised, as a serving major in the U.S. Army, quote unquote, theoretical questions such as, would it be permissible for me to kill my fellow servicemen if they are infidels? That's how important he was, because fundamentally Anwar al-Awlaki sanctioned Major Nidal Hasan's Fort Hood attack. So yes, even in the case of Fort Hood, very important.
Another thing you point out in the book is the overlap between Islamic ideology and Marxist ideology. There's a very similar language and strategy, it seems to me.
Yes, this is, I'm a child of the Cold War. My parents escaped a communist dictatorship. So for me, it was easy to see the clear parallels. The bottom line is the jihadi movement is at its core a totalitarian ideology. Yes, it is religiously informed, but remember Arthur Koestler, the famous former communist, said communism is a godless religion. In its paranoia, in its attitude to absolutism, in its conspiratorial nature, and the way that it will brook no compromise, the jihadi ideology is very, very close genetically to fascism and to communism.
Well, I wanted to have you comment on the habit of the press of instantly, in the first round of reportage of an attack that's obviously inspired by ISIS, they'll do one of 3 or 4 things. They will label the attacker a lone wolf, separating him from any international efforts. They will use the family name, the American name, first, as opposed to the chosen Muslim one. They will write them off as mentally ill. And then they'll quote a politician or someone from law enforcement saying, we really have no idea about the motive here at all. That's a habit I've noticed in the media's treatment of these events.
Yeah, the shocking reality is, in the last 8 years, the narrative has been more important than the truth. Remember, after Orlando, there was this spurious argument for more than a week that this was a frustrated homosexual taking revenge out on a Latin lover. I mean, they would go to the greatest lengths to create complete fabrications out of whole cloth. Why is this? Because there is this idea that all religions are equal. Multiculturalism means all cultures are the same or of the same value. And as such, they can't admit what is staring them in the face, that these are individuals who aren't victims. They can't be explained away through other motivations. They make a conscious choice to follow the life of the jihadi. That approach to reality, that common sense approach, is, I think, something we will see more and more of after January 20th.
Finally, go ahead.
So one more question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the threat knowledge group, because you have some pretty scary statistics about activity that's going on right now. Cells that are here, cells that have already been activated, the existence of networks here on U.S. soil that are basically waiting to get the green light from their higher ups. It's very easy, Dr. Gorka, to become afraid and helpless. What do you recommend attitudinally for people once they see some data? What can be done? What can the average person do?
Fear is not a useful emotion. Read the facts at our website, threatknowledge.org. When you realize that the war is real, the war is here, that ISIS has recruited more than 120 people in America to execute terrorist attacks in the last 2.5 years, then there is no reason for fear, because you will be cognizant of your surroundings. You will note that it is not advisable to walk down the street staring at your iPhone or your Android. If the people living next to the San Bernardino killers had actually reported the suspicious behavior they noted of the couple in preparation for their attack, those 14 people could be alive today. So, as the police say, have your head on a swivel and understand that the front line in this war begins when you leave your house in the morning. You don't have to carry a badge or a gun to be part of this war, but you should be aware. And if you see something, you really should say something, because that way you can save lives.
Well, we appreciate you taking time to hang out and fill in some uncomfortable facts. It was an honor. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. God bless, and God bless
you. Yep, amen to that. You can follow him at Twitter. It's at sebgorka.com. The book is called Defeating Jihad, and his website is thegorkabriefing.com. I'm Patrick Coffin. This is The Patrick Coffin Show.